Indiana State Fair Bicentennial Year. Welcome. My name's Tina Jesson. I'm the owner and founder of Tina's Traditional Old English Kitchen and Tea Room. We're actually based in Carmel. And what I'm going to be demonstrating today is our cranberry scones. So I've got some lovely cranberry scones here. I'm going to be showing you how to make those today. Okay, so normally this is my third year actually, fourth year back here. We moved here back in 2008, and it was August the 1st, 2008. And the first thing we did was come to the Indiana State Fair. So I've been a fan for years, and the fact that we keep being invited back to demonstrate something English in Indiana, I always think is kind of amusing and a lot of fun. So scones, they have very few ingredients, and this is an English scones recipe, and you'll find the base recipe in the Tina's Traditional Book of Scones, which is actually for sale in the Indiana Grown Marketplace, sponsored by Marsh. And you'll see that we also, being a tea room, we have a range of loose leaf teas and some jellies, and I'm going to be serving these scones a little while later with a vanilla chai tea-flavored jelly. So you're going to be in for a double treat today. So normally when I come here, I lug my KitchenAid, which is quite heavy when I've got all my other ingredients, from the parking lot. This year, I've decided to go back to basics and show you how I actually learnt how to make scones from scratch from my grandmother. So all I have is a lightweight bowl and a fork. That's going to replace my KitchenAid. So it's going to take me a little while longer to do this. But we only have a few ingredients to work with here. For those of you that want to make notes, I'm going to go through the weights and measures. So I've got a pound of flour. I've got a pinch of salt. I've got 4 teaspoons of baking powder. Now, a note on baking powder. Has anybody made scones before? Have you ever? Oh, a few of you. Wonderful. Now, sometimes scones have that really strange aftertaste. I don't know if you've ever noticed that with a scone. The trick, and it took me a couple of years to work this out, use baking powder that is aluminum-free. That will not give you that strange aftertaste that you sometimes get, which is very noticeable in a scone, less so in other baked goods, but aluminum-free is my top tip today. So 4 teaspoons of that. Then we have 2 ounces of sugar, and I'm making cranberry scones today, so I've got 4 ounces of cranberry. Now, if you wanted to make a cheese scone or a savory scone, you'd omit the sugar and you'd change 4 ounces of dried fruit for 4 ounces of cheese, for example. So the base recipe is very simple indeed. So I'm going to start off by putting my pound of flour, and this is just regular all-purpose flour, into my bowl. And I've already pre-chopped 4 ounces of butter that I'm going to add to this. Sorry, 8 ounces of butter that I've added to this. So this is going to help. This is going to help on my doing this all by hand. So first of all, I'm just going to coat these chunks of butter with the flour. And I'm actually going to add the salt to this as well at the same time. We are actually using a European-style butter, so it's a salt-free, unsalted butter. So I'm just going to add a little pinch of the salt there and just mix that together. And what we're going to do, I remember my grandmother always telling me that most pastries, and to be fair, a scone kind of starts off life as a pastry style mix. The idea is half fat to flour, so it's 8 ounces of fat to my 1 pound of flour, and we want to get this to look like breadcrumbs, so it's called the rubbing in process. Now, I use a fork because in England we don't have fancy gadgets, so this is just a long-pronged fork that I'm using. But I have seen, since moving here to the States, one of those kind of pastry rockers, and it chops this all up for you as well. Because I'm going very low-tech today, I am just going to be using a fork, so you don't need any fancy equipment for this. And I'm just going to start breaking up those chunks of butter. So it's starting to blend in with my flour, and I'm aiming for that breadcrumb look. So That's what we're going for to start with. Now, my mum is a very good pastry maker. Her short crust is very short, and I'm not too bad at making pastry either. And the trick of a good pastry is cold hands. And having bad circulation in our family means that we make pretty good pastry. And I didn't actually, when I was interviewing for my baker, I didn't say, you know, do you have poor circulation and do you have cold hands because you'll make great pastry? But it turns out that my baker, my head baker now, Ellie, also has cold hands, bad circulation, and makes a really good pastry. So if you don't suffer from cold hands, I'll give you a little top tip. My hands are quite warm today because I've been running around. So a good tip is to take the cold water tap and just run some water on your wrists, and that will just cool down your hands a few degrees, and that will make it a lot easier once you start putting your hands into the flour. So I've started to break down these chunks of butter with my fork, and the best way of doing this is just pressing the fork against the side of the bowl or the bottom of the bowl, and I'm just gradually turning the bowl as I go. And then when I've done this for a few minutes, I can see where my chunks are just by shaking the bowl, and all the big lumps will come to the top. And then I'm going to get the hands in, and this is where the rubbing in technique really takes place. So what I'm doing here is I'm just taking the butter in my fingertips with some of the flour, and I'm just rubbing between my little finger and my index finger. So I'm just rubbing the fat into the flour across my fingers. And I think this is one of those techniques that is starting to disappear because we are relying so much on our mechanical aids in the kitchen. And I always think that, I mean, this feels so lovely because the flour is very velvety and the butter is kind of soft and squidgy. And I think this is where the love goes when you're making something by hand. Do we have anyone that watches the Great British Baking Show? It seems to be really popular this year. I've had so many people come into the Tearoom and mention it to me. And it's great to see that the artisan baking is really coming back again. And I must admit, me and my husband do watch the show quite avidly. And we smile when it's raining. And then we go, oh, it's so green. It's because it rains a lot. So what I'm doing here is I'm just taking the flour, rubbing it through my fingers, and I'm going from the front of the bowl into the middle of the bowl. And then I'm going to turn, half a turn, and I'm going to do the same again. And this will mean that I've got good coverage right across the bowl of all the flour and all that butter. It does take a little bit longer this way, but it was a long time before I actually bought my first KitchenAid. I was actually selling scones at farmers markets and making the scones by hand like this back in 2011. And then when I'd saved up enough money, I bought my first KitchenAid. When they're not cheap, they're what, $500 or so. So quite an expensive investment. I'm just turning again and carry on rubbing that flour and fat together. But what I found when I started using the KitchenAid, I'd not been trained on how to use a KitchenAid. I didn't really know what I was doing, so it was a little trial and error. I just tend to keep the KitchenAid speed at number 1 while I'm doing this, and I use the paddle. So not the whipping one, not the bread dough hook, but the other one. That's what I would do for this, and I just keep it on the low speed. But the lovely thing about using it mechanically is you can actually walk away from the table and it's carry on doing the work for you, where obviously when you're doing it by hand like this, you've got to kind of stay with it, otherwise nothing happens. So let's have a look how well this is doing. So I've gone my 4 turns and shake again, and I can just see a few little areas that need attention, but that's looking like, funnily enough, that's looking like breadcrumbs. Okay, I'm just going to rinse my hands off here. I've got a piece of wire under my foot, which is kind of getting in the way, so if you see me slip and slide, that's what's happening back here. Okay, so I've got my flour my salt and my butter all together there. I'm going to add in my baking powder, the aluminum-free baking powder, and there's 4 teaspoons in here. I have it all measured out, so we can just drop and go. And I'm just going to use the fork to mix it in. And because this is going to be a sweet scone, the 2 ingredients I'm going to add next are the sugar and the dried fruit. But at this point, this is a basic scones mixture, so you could go either sweet or savory at this point. So we could put 4 ounces of grated cheese in here and make a cheese scone, had herbs, herb and cheese scone. You could chop up some black olives. I like black olives, pop that in there. So you could do lots of things on the savory side. And in the cookbook, we've got 15 recipes. Roughly half are savory scones and the other half is sweet. So this would be the savory mix. But because we're going sweet, we are now going to add 2 ounces of sugar. This is a fine granulated sugar, but a thick granulated sugar would work just as well. And we're just going to mix this in briefly. Now, the other ingredient that's going to bind this together is going to be our milk. And there's going to be about 8 ounces in here, but I'm not just going to pour 8 ounces in. I'm going to mix it until it starts to come together. So it might be a little bit less, because the amount of liquid you use in any pastry or dough depends on it really depends on the flour and how absorbent your flour is. So it will vary between brands. So although baking is quite a precise science, this is the bit that becomes a little bit more less of a science, because it depends on that absorption factor of the flour. So I've just made a little well in the center, and I've just added a little of the milk, and I'm starting to mix this together to start to pull the dough together and start it to bind. And then I'm going to add a little bit more and a little bit more until we get to that position where it's starting to come together. Not too wet, not too dry. Now, if your dough goes too wet, you can add more flour, but that's going to affect the structure of the scone. If you don't correct it and you start cutting it out and putting it on the baking sheet and go on to bake it, you might find that your scones start to spread. So if they don't get the height but they spread out, it's because the dough is too wet. Well, this is starting to come together quite well, actually. Now, you can use a full-fat milk, you can use cream, or you can use buttermilk. All of the recipes, or all of those milks, will give you a slightly different texture. We tend to use a full-fat milk, or buttermilk, in our scones. They are more tender than the American version. Not quite sure why. I'm not an expert on the American scone recipe, but I know these aren't going to be as dry. So I've started to put my hands in here and starting to pull the dough together, and I'm just adding a little more of the milk as we go. And what I'm looking for is this to clump together, not too wet, so I'm trying to mop up all the moisture I can feel in the dough into the dry parts of the flour in my bowl. So I'm still seeing a little bit of flour around the edge that I'm just trying to basically mop up with my wetter part of my dough. And this is still a little crumbly. I know this because it's not sticking to my fingers too much, so I'm just going to add a spot more. Okay, now I have